Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Urban Update. I'm Byron Barnett. We've got an exciting show where we've brought back a couple of panel of experts to discuss local and national issues concerning communities of color. As promised, Urban Update will provide these roundtable discussions from time to time. This week, we will focus on race and the law, as we'll look at some high-profile events recently. We'll discuss the LA Clippers owner, Donald Sterling, and the controversy surrounding his comments. We'll look at the recent Supreme Court affirmative action decision, and we'll wrap up the show with members of the Black and Latino Collaboration, which has put out a racial and economic report that has everyone in Boston talking. But first up, the nation last week marked the 60th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education historic decision, which effectively outlawed racial segregated schools across the country. Today, with our guests on Urban Update, we will examine the aftermath of the Brown decision 60 years later. Our guests include retired Chief U.S. Magistrate Judge Joyce London Alexander Ford, who was appointed to the federal bench by former President Jimmy Carter. Our other guest is Kevin Peterson, founder of the New Democracy Coalition, and is senior fellow at the Center for Collaborative Leadership at UMass Boston. Peterson's lectured around the country and in Africa on civic engagement and democracy. Welcome to Urban Update. Thanks for coming in. Well, a 2013 University of North Carolina study revealed that more than 40% of blacks now attend quote-unquote apartheid schools that are highly segregated. Have we gone backwards? Judge Alexander Ford, I guess I'll start with you. How should we be assessing the Brown decision 60 years later? Have we gone backwards? Have we made progress?
I think we've waned somewhat on our commitment to equality in education. I'd add to that wealth. I'd add to that housing. You're right. We have 40% of black children attend segregated schools, where 10% of their classmates are white. But in that 40%, we have also Latino children and other brown children.
Isn't that what Brown was supposed to take care of?
It's absolutely what it was supposed to take care of. But there's a retrenchment. There's a retrenchment in this country ongoing everywhere. And I think there's as I was saying earlier, there's a distinct difference between the North and the South, because there always has been. There's been more overt racism in the South than there is here in the North.
But Judge, I would venture to say that retrenchment might be too light of a word. Some would say that the Brown experiment as a policy, as a legal policy, has failed. If we are, as a nation, worse than we were in 1968, 20 years after Brown, then we have a real problem. And I think we need to be honest and sober about the reality that this policy may have failed, and we may have to look at some other remedies in order to close the achievement gap between blacks and whites.
What tools do you have? Brown versus Board, that's the Supreme Court. What other tool could there possibly be?
Well, there could be other remedies that integrate communities, so that certain school districts and certain neighborhoods are more integrated, and which would lead to more integrated public schools. I'm not sure, but what's clear to me is that the policy seems to have failed.
I don't agree with that, Kevin. I don't agree that it failed. I think that was the first most important step
Certainly was important.
in bringing together all races. And I think there has been, when I say retrenchment, I mean on the part, if I look at Boston, I mean on the part of everybody.
See, I don't disagree that there hasn't been entrenchment. I don't disagree that it was an important piece of legislation. But 60 years later, we're in worse shape than we were than we were in terms of school integration at the height of the civil rights movement. That's a problem. W. Du Bois said something very, very interesting about segregation. To the extent that he believed that it was okay. He opposed Brown. He said that segregated schools would be okay if we could fund black schools at the level that white schools were funded. If we could build black schools at the level and the quality that white schools. Why do we need the integration? Is a point that Du Bois made. That argument may have salience even today.
We want people to join together. We don't want a separate society of African Americans, a separate society of white Americans, a separate society of Hispanics. That's why.
Okay,
no, we don't want
No, okay, let me jump in. Now, Judge, now you mentioned before we go to a break, you mentioned Boston, and let's talk about Boston and how this the Brown decision affects Boston, specifically in the context of a little controversy on the Boston City Council. We had 3 city councilors. There was a measure to honor to recognize the 60th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, ending segregation in American schools. 3 members, Steve Murphy, Bill Linehan, and Sal Lamantina, voted present, and apparently there was some concern about how Brown somehow caused the busing crisis because of segregating the schools. What do you make of that? Kevin, what do you make of that?
Well, I think they were conflating issues. Brown had nothing to do with the Garrity decision, which came about 30 years later. I think that.
But Garrity was trying to segregate the schools desegregate the schools as Brown was supposed to desegregate the schools.
Yeah, but a legal case did not emanate from Boston. So there was a distinction. I think that there is still a whole bunch of nervousness and concern and maybe even latent racism that still rises to the surface, even among our elected officials, when the issue of busing or anything connected to integration comes up.
Is that a fair comparison, Judge?
I think so.
Comparing the busing crisis with the Brown versus Board of Education. I mean, is that a fair comparison? To not support one because of the other?
No, I don't think you should not support one because of the other, but I agree with Kevin's analysis on the issue. I just think that there isn't a latent issue here. It's patent. That's the only thing I would add. But I agree with his analysis.
Well, so I guess the bottom line is the idea that someone would vote present, not vote to support Brown versus Board because of busing.
Well, I think it speaks to the fact that even our elected officials need to be more informed about Brown and about Garrity, and need to be more open to where we are as a society 60 years after Brown. I think it's unfortunate that they would think that this would be a controversial issue enough for them only to vote present and not affirm the anniversary of a very important piece of legislation, which I still contend may be outdated and may be considered a failure.
Okay, and we'll leave it right there. We're going to continue our
disagree.
discussion. Okay, you disagree. Well, we're going to be right back, and you two can disagree a little bit more.